Good evening and welcome to the latest edition of The World Today. I'm going to be discussing the war in Yemen with Helen Lackner, who has been visiting this country for many decades and probably knows it better than any other foreign scholar I can think of. Helen has just produced a book called Yemen in Crisis: Autocracy, Neoliberalism, and the Disintegration of a State. The subtitle actually says it all because it gives an account of what has been happening to that country over the last few decades, and particularly since the Arab Spring sparked off another round of protest movements in the Yemen. The situation now is dire. There is no other way of putting it. A huge cholera epidemic, malnutrition, starvation, a blockade on Yemen, which is having appalling impact, and then add to that drone attacks, bombing, Saudi occupation backed by the United States of America and the West in general, British special operatives involved in helping the drone attacks, etc., etc. Helen, let's start off by asking you, how did we get here?
Well, the crisis in Yemen itself, I think, was coming, and the disintegration of the state and the civil war was coming as a result of the way the 2011 crisis was addressed. I think the element that surprised me and many other people was the international military intervention, which we hadn't predicted. I mean, from the early 2000s onwards, people were generally saying this regime is on its last legs. Something's going to happen. By the time of end of 2010, really, there were already massive movements going on throughout the country. And the impact of Tunisia and Egypt was really to simply allow people to really explode even more than they would have. I mean, I was in Sana'a on the day Mubarak fell, and it was just amazing, you know, from one second to the other. I was working with a friend and the whole street exploded in sounds and car horns, and everybody was coming out in celebration. And the events of 2011 were really, in my view, the most important popular movement that happened in Yemen, possibly ever, but certainly for many decades, because it involved mostly young people, but then 70% of the Yemeni population are young. So being young is not a, particular characteristic. But it involved women, which is much more surprising, and it involved, again, urban and rural people. I mean, again, 70% of the population are rural, but many of them come and work in the cities, or they're studying in the cities. So this was this enormous movement happening in Sana'a, in Taiz, in most of the cities, and even some of the smaller towns. And what happened later in the year is the involvement of the international community, and who were really determined to try and make sure that Yemen stayed on the correct path. And
the correct path meaning?
Meaning a path that would not challenge the neoliberal economic agenda of the World Bank and others, and indeed would not challenge the social organization and other elements that you found throughout the peninsula elsewhere. I think it's worth remembering that for all its faults, the Saleh regime actually was a republic in which you had genuine elections. There were tricks and there was manipulation, but they were still fairly genuine elections, and there was a reasonable opposition. Most of it was unfortunately an Islamist opposition, but it was an opposition that had some influence, and that is the only republic in the whole Arabian Peninsula. So I think that's an element that's important. But the problem was that that basically within 2 months, after one particular murderous incident, the army and the military split. And so the movement and one group decided that it was going to support the revolution. And this process of supporting the revolution, of course, meant that it tried to take control of the revolution. And so after that period, although the political opposition parties and others had been present from the beginning, the movement was much more under their control after that event. And the demands of the demonstrators basically were decent jobs, incomes, dignity, respect, all the usual demands that were in other.
But in Egypt, the central demand was, we want the downfall of this regime. That was also the case in Yemen?
The main slogan was Irhal, get out.
Get out.
You know, or in French, dégager. Yeah. Get out. I mean, Saleh out. Yes, that was the main slogan, which absolutely unified everybody. And that one unified both the more progressive elements of the movement as well as the Islamists and everybody else. And indeed the Houthis, who are now in control of a significant part of the country.
Before we carry on the war, Helen, just explain to us two things. One is the Islamists in the Yemen. There was the Islah party, which were what is now described as moderate Islamists, not like Al-Qaeda, not terrorist organizations, but fairly normal in the Arab world and the Muslim world in general. That's the first element. And then secondly, there's the Houthis on the border with Saudi Arabia, sometimes described, which they are of course as Shia, but sometimes described as very ultra-religious Shia, trying to bring back the imamate. What could you explain the makeup of these different groups?
Yeah, I think the Islah, the first thing about the Islah is that it's a conglomerate of two very separate groups. One are similar to standard Muslim Brothers, though they are not following of the Egyptian model or indeed any other specific model, but they are relatively reasonably described as Muslim Brothers. And the other one are northern Zaidi tribesmen, and the two allied to form the Islah party. And although the northern tribesmen and the Al-Ahmar group in particular, are conservative socially in many senses, I wouldn't call them Islamist in the political sense. So I think that's an important distinction to work out about Islah. The other element of the Houthis, of course, is that it brings, to understand them, you have to look at to some extent, the religious aspect, which is Yemen has two main forms of Islam. One is the Sunni of the Shafi'i variety, and that is basically most of the population of the western coast, of the south, and indeed the eastern desert. And then you have in the central pocket, if you look at the map of the highlands, you have the Zaydis, who are a form of Shia, but they are not 12 Shia as in Iran.
No.
And in terms of theology, they're not that different from the Sunnis. They've always prayed in the same mosques and they got on fine. The Houthi movement was founded and is led by a group of descendants of people who claim to be descendants of the Prophet, who in Yemen are usually known as Sada, but who are also known as Hashimis and Ashraf in other countries, but of the Zaydi variety. But again, sectarianism does not fit into the Yemeni pattern, because basically the only real ideological view of the Houthis, other than the standard social characteristics of Islamists, is that they believe that descendants of the Prophet, Sada, have the right to rule.
You talk about the Zaydis as unorthodox Shia who pray commonly with Sunnis in the same mosques, etc. Just next door you have the Saudi state in Saudi Arabia, where the official theology stroke ideology is Wahhabism. This Wahhabism, apart from the Al-Qaeda business, never actually took root in the Yemen. Why is that?
Well, the Salafi movement started in Yemen, and indeed that was one of the origins of the Houthi movement, was the installation of some converted Zaydis, particularly a guy called Muqbil al-Wadi'i, who set up a Salafi school in Saada in the 90s, I forget the exact date. And that was very heavily influenced by Wahhabism, and that developed a very strong Salafi movement, which could be described as being quite close to the Wahhabis. I mean, as you know, the Wahhabis don't call themselves Wahhabis.
No, of course not.
They can also call themselves Salafis, and in any case, nowadays, they are now no longer that. They are now moderate Islam, according to one Mohammed bin Salman a few weeks ago. A whole new review of Saudi history for the last 50 years. But now, for example, you have a situation where the main military forces supporting the supposed official recognized government and operating primarily with the Emiratis are Salafi groups.
So, Helen, what was the link then to the civil war? We have 2011, we have the so-called Arab Spring, which has ended badly in most places. We have this mass movement of young people in the Yemen, and you had got to telling us that then the military split and a section of the military came over to the movement supposedly and took it over. Was that the trigger then for civil war?
No, that was stopped by the GCC agreement. There was some fighting going on throughout 2011, and then there was this agreement which was became officially known as the GCC agreement, signed in November.
By everyone.
It was signed by most groups in April, but Ali Abdullah Saleh refused to sign it, and he finally signed it in November 2011 in Riyadh. And one thing I always mention to people is that that ceremony, which had any number of ambassadors and other important people and senior Yemenis, etc., present, and I'm sure you can find a picture of it, there was only one person smiling, and that was Ali Abdullah Saleh. Everybody else was looking quite grim. And I think that's because the agreement, as he knew, was not going to deprive him of. It deprived him of the presidency, but it didn't deprive him of a lot of his power. He retained his position as head of his political party, the General People's Congress. He retained the right to stay in Yemen, and the agreement gave him and his party 50% of the positions in the supposed government of national unity, with the other 50% having to be shared between the formal official opposition parties and the new movements that had emerged from 2011, women, youth, civil society. There was a big event called the National Dialogue Conference, which went on for 9 months, which had a lot of positive elements, and it brought a lot of people together. But it was very badly managed, largely by the United Nations. And it's after this ended and after the new constitution or draft constitution was prepared and not submitted to a body that the civil war really started, because the Houthis by 2014 had taken over a lot of the northern part of the country, and they moved into Sana'a unopposed. They basically became unopposed in Sana'a because by that time they were in an unofficial and then secret alliance with Ali Abdullah Saleh and his very strong military security forces. And President Hadi, who also was the previous vice president of Saleh, had also thought that he would be able to use the Houthis to defeat the Islah, who he was officially allied with but was not happy with. And basically that was a very serious tactical error. It didn't work. And the eventual result was that the Houthis took over. They had what I called a slow coup, because it took about 3 or 4 months before the takeover was finalized. And eventually Hadi was kept in house arrest. He escaped, went to Aden, declared Aden to be an interim capital, and the Houthis basically and Saleh people followed. And he then escaped and asked for the Saudi and other friendly support to restore himself to power.
And the Houthi domination of the opposition movement, and later their deal with Saleh, created, at least that's what the American press wrote, that there's a danger of Yemen becoming an Iranian stooge state on the edges of Saudi Arabia, which was clearly the thing the Saudis were telling them, as well as the Israelis. So it suddenly became part of the geopolitical clashes taking place in the whole region, which has led effectively to the situation today.
Initially, the intervention was stated to be to put back in power
the legitimate
the so-called legitimate, because there's a lot of debate, and lawyers could have a lot of fun discussing whether it or not and the level of legitimacy. But I think it became gradually and increasingly described as the Houthis being Iranian proxies, which is basically not the fact. The Houthis the Houthis are not 12 Shia, though there is some clear influence. There is definitely a much stronger relationship between the Houthis and the Iranians today than there was 10 years ago.
Obviously, but did the Iranians arm them?
But the Houthis really don't do what the Iranians tell them. The Iranians told them clearly, don't go into Sana'a. They went into Sana'a. The Iranians told them clearly, don't go into Aden. They went into Aden. So it's not as if they are not puppets. They have their own interest. Iranian involvement there is Iranian involvement. I think also we need to recognize that in Iran you have a much wider range of political views, from much more extremist to much more liberal groups such as the Rouhani group. So I think you have a wider range of political views. And some of them have, used the propaganda element, the Sana'a, the fourth capital city under our control, and, we're going to set up bases on the Red Sea, and I don't know what other nonsense has been said. But that does not represent, A, the view of the Houthis, who are not willing to have these kinds of things, or indeed the views of the Iranian official government. My understanding is that there is some military support. And there may be a few bits of highly sophisticated equipment. But basically the missiles that the Houthis are sending onto Saudi are basically Scuds, old-fashioned Russian Scuds that have been modified and improved. I think if you look at the latest UN panel of experts report, they say that there is some evidence that there might be some Iranian elements. But they also point out that some other bits of these things have been bought on the open market and are made in the USA. And I think the other thing we have to remember is that with the Saudis and the Saudi Emirati, because the Emiratis are at least as active as the Saudis, it's not just a Saudi thing. They've now been in there for 3 years and almost 3 months. We're well into the 4th year of this war. And they have failed to defeat this group of ill-equipped mountain tribesmen with rather limited weaponry. So they also need to explain how they failed. And to say that all this is Iranian proxies and the horrible Iranians are responsible for it helps to justify their failure.
Of the war. Then there have also been huge demonstrations in Sana'a, clearly supported by most people, against the war and demanding that the Saudis get out.
And when the short period in which there was a 3-month ceasefire in 2016, the support for the Houthis and the support for Saleh went down, and the hostility to the Saudis also, went down. So what you have now is, and there is a much stronger support in the population for Saleh now and before he died. And I think one of the incentives the Houthis had to kill him was seeing the very large demonstrations that came out in support of Saleh last August. Because he was, in a sense, he was an autocrat. He stole loads of money, but he was a nationalist of sorts, and he did, and I think his main pride was having established Yemeni unity, and I think that was a view it was shared by many. So there were a lot of people, ordinary people who supported him. Not everybody who came out in the streets were paid to do so, though at other times many people were. I'm not saying none of them were. So I think it's a complicated situation. But I think the important thing to know is that the Houthis, on the other hand, are, I think, very, very unpopular. And in a way that was a tactical mistake Saleh made in his area, which was to let the Houthis take the front so they would be blamed for everything. And that worked, but they also managed, through this process and others, to weaken Saleh's military capacity and security capacity, and that's why they eventually managed to defeat him.
But why was it necessary to kill Saleh, which is what the Houthis did?
I think it was a big mistake, and I think many of them think it was a big mistake now.
But what was the justification in their mind? He was too powerful, too popular?
Yeah, he was too popular, probably. He was too popular. But I think, for example, just recently there was an airstrike that killed the official president of the entity, Saleh al-Samad, and he was a moderate amongst the Houthis, if you can use that term. And he's somebody who, was having discussions with the United Nations, who was willing to discuss attempts to have another peace agreement.
Helen, do you think there is a serious possibility that the Yemen will break up? I'll explain to you why I asked this question. When I was in the Yemen in 2010, before it escalated into what it has become, people in the south I spoke to said that the repression against any contrary opinions, especially in the south, were more or less prohibited. Newspapers were attacked, journalists were imprisoned. So there was a great deal of unease, and almost everyone I talked to said that if this carries on, the South will demand a separate state, and not like the old state that the left created, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, but something which may be different, which none of us will like, because it could be a Saudi-dominated state, and that the country will break up into 2 or 3 bits. What is your opinion on this?
In the long run, the issues of the South is a fundamental issue. The likelihood of Yemen either being the Republic of Yemen that existed from 1990 to 2015, or indeed of 2 states as the 2 previous states existed, is just not on. There are a large number of southern separatist movements, and for a while they managed to have some pretense that this was a unified southern separatist movement, but this hasn't papered the cracks, which have already started appearing again. And a more realistic vision of what might happen is really going back to the British period, where you had a whole series of statelets, microscopic places with a few thousand inhabitants and no resources. And my vision is that, well, it's very difficult to have a vision for the future, but I'm quite convinced that should the South, according to its former borders, declare independence within a matter of hours or at most days, it will further break up into a whole series of additional entities. most of which really have no economic viability, let alone social.
This is why I asked about the United States and its allies. I mean, what they seem to be doing in Iraq, in Syria, and even in Libya, through their actions, and now it's a pattern of breaking up these countries so that sovereignty becomes irrelevant. I mean, it's impossible to have a tiny statelet as a sovereign state. It has to be allied or aligned to one or the other, as they were in the old days of imperialism. So what is American thinking on all this?
Well, I think my opinion is that there isn't really that deeper US interest in
the Yemen.
Because there's not much in the way of resources that are of any great interest. I think it's much more the Gulf states taking their own initiatives. I think the issue for them, and I think many people who have said, is the US doesn't have a Yemen policy. The US has a counterterrorism policy. And the US involvement is primarily, supposedly, against Al-Qaeda and so-called IS, which isn't really a significant element in Yemen, and the drone strikes and the airstrikes that they have against those elements, or people whom they claim are against those elements, and the direct support for the Saudi-led coalition, which is basically Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, with British and American and French support, and one can crudely say the mercenary support of the troops. So many thousands of Sudanese aren't there for the pleasure of supporting the Saudi policies. They're there for the
being
cash.
paid.
And we have places like Senegal. Joined the coalition. So it's either in anticipation of serious financial assistance, or in exchange for existing serious financial assistance. What's interesting, of course, here is Egypt, which was expected to be a strong element, and which can't refuse, but they've certainly refused to put any troops on the ground. They remember
what happened,
the 62 to 70 civil war. And another interesting one, of course, is Pakistan.
Yeah.
Which was expected to be the leading member of the coalition, and which successfully managed to maneuver things in such a way that they didn't get involved at all.
Interestingly enough, in Pakistan, there was a unanimous vote in parliament. All the political parties voted unanimously against any Pakistani military involvement in the Yemen.
And I think that upset the Saudis, because they really didn't expect that.
Yeah, the Saudis weren't expecting that at all, because they fund this country and, more or less run it at times. But they were pretty shaken by that. Helen, thanks very much. It's been great talking to you. Congratulations on the book. And all we can do is hope for better times.
Yes, and I also hope that, when it comes to Yemen, people learn more about it, find more about it, and indeed do what they can to help, which isn't very much, but at least being aware is a step forward. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.